Hello folks, it's been a while since I've made a video, but I've had something on my mind. I'll entitle the video A Tale of Two Temples, or maybe three. Anyway, temple. I did a word search. I'm sort of a words kind of person. Words mean something, and I looked at the word temple closely. Now, in the Old Testament, there's actually three words. Well, there is a fourth one under temples. It's Hebrews 7:541, and it refers to the side of the head, thin-fleshed, the temples here. And that's Hebrews 75:41. Also, while I was in that neighborhood, I saw the root RAQ, rock, and that's 75:34. A lot of us have looked at Rakah and Rakia in regards to the firmament, and the root rock RAQ is emaciated, as if flattened out. So just an extra that I found along the way, but. Hebrew 1964 and 1965 are two of the primary ones used in the Old Testament for temple. Haykal, a large public building, and H 1965, also Haykal, is a palace or temple. Also there is H 1004, Bayith, which is like a house, a palace, a family dwelling. Which it derives partially from 1129 Banah, B-A-N-A-H, Banah, to build, make, repair, or set up. So those are the Old Testament words for temple. And in the New Testament, there's two Greek words that are translated as temple. There is one exception to that, and that is in the book of Luke, and I believe it was verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 51, and that particular, Luke 11:51, and the word is Greek 36:24 in the Strong's, oikos, family, home, or household, and that's used just but one time in the entirety of the New Testament. All right. Two words in the New Testament, Greek 24:11, hieron, that's H-I-E-R-O-N, hieron, which comes out of hieros, which is 24:13, meaning sacred or holy. And you'll find that hieron is used in the Gospels and Acts and Corinthians, and it means a physical building, a holy or sacred place, sometimes to include the entire precincts of the temple and temple itself. So a holy or sacred place, entire precincts, or temple, typically physical building. And Greek 3485, naos, N-A-O-S, defined as fane, F-A-N-E, which is an archaic term that means temple. Fane, shrine, temple, inner sanctum, and central sanctuary. And you'll find that in some of the epistles and in Revelation. So I'd like to take a look at the book of the Gospel, John chapter 2, and I'm going to read several verses here, and I'll pick up with verse 12. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. And that was right after the beginning of Jesus' miracles, John chapter 2, after he did the water to wine at the feast. And then verse 13, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Verse 14, and found in the temple that those sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made, verse 15, a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. So this is where he threw the money changers out of the temple. And when you go into the Strongs and you look at those two entries of the word temple, where they were selling oxen and he drove them out of the temple, that's number 2411, hieros. Let's continue. Verse 16, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up. Verse 18, then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Verse 19, Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Verse 20, then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in the building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body, verse 21. And in the Strongs, verses 19, 20, and 21 are all naos. So in verse 19, it's obvious, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Jesus was referring to his body. And then in verse 20, it shows in the Strongs, number 3485, then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? And verse 21, but he spake of the temple of his body, which obviously is naos. Naos is the temple that is used when referring to the temple of the body. And in just John chapter 2 alone, temple appears 5 times, verses 14 and 15, which are hieron, which he went to the temple and threw them out of the temple. So that's obvious. And in verse 19, Jesus was speaking and said, destroy this temple, meaning his body. Verse 21 says, but he spake of the temple of his body, so obviously that. But verse 20 is also naos. So 19, 20, and 21 were all naos, and verses 14 and 15 were hieron. So were the Jews 46 years was this temple in building? It is possible that around that time that it had been under construction for 46 years. The documentation that I found was that it took actually 80 years. It wasn't actually completed until somewhere around 62 to 64 AD, and then shortly thereafter in 70 it was destroyed. And there was the original temple that Solomon built in 966 to 959 BC, and it stood, it shows it's completed in 959, so it took about 7 years. And some things I saw said 7 years, some things said 20. Of course, we know that David, before Solomon, gathered the materials, but he had bloody hands, so he wasn't allowed to build it. So Solomon built it. So he built it, finished it in 959, and 586 was when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. So that was the first temple. But during the time of Darius and Zerubbabel, it was rebuilt, which was in a range of, I think they started trying to work on it in the 530s, but things got really going in the 520s, and by 522, 521, and then by 515 it repaired, basically. So, and then that stood for approximately, or a little less than 500 years or thereabouts. And then Herod built the third temple, really, Solomon the first. During the time of Darius, they repaired the damage from Nebuchadnezzar, and so that was a rebuilding, so to speak, at the very least, because it took a lot of effort and money and several years to do it. And then after 500 years had elapsed and all the different things that had happened, it needed repaired. And the Jews were upset at the idea of Herod building the temple. I mean, Herod had built temples for pagans, and he was a builder. He had a big ego, and he commanded a lot of resources, I guess. But he had built a lot of large structures during his time. And then about 20 years into his reign over Judea, then he decided he was going to rebuild the temple, because it was in disrepair after 500 years. And they say that he destroyed it, but like the Jews wanted it to be rebuilt really fast. And in this passage, it says this temple in building was 46 years. But other documentation shows that because the Jews were upset at him leveling it, it got rebuilt like in a year and a half to maybe 3 years. So the temple itself was rebuilt in a short period of time. Although they worked on the whole thing, outer courts and outbuildings and etc., for 80 years. So I guess if it was referring in John 2:20 when it says temple, and they're talking about building the temple for 46 years, why is it not hieros, number 2411? However, it's naos, 3485, the same hieron, naos rather, that is translated as temple in verses 19 and 21, when obviously Jesus was talking about his body, the temple. So did John have a moment of laziness when he was writing the gospel and didn't change verse 20 to the building? Was it that particular Jew referring to his own temple, and he was 46 years in the making? So that's a little bit of a question. If it's referring to the physical temple, why wouldn't it be 24:11 like it was in verses 14 and 15? So right there in one chapter, temples used 5 times, the first 2 times being hieron, referring to the building, and 19, 20, and 21 being naos, and 2 of those 3 verses obviously referring to the temple of the body. Okay, so that point being made, in the New Testament, temple or temples is used 117 times, and it doesn't appear in every book. 71 of the times it's hieros. 46 of the times it's naos. So 24:11, hieron is more typically associated with the physical building, whereas 34:85 naos is very often associated with the body, as it was in John 2:21, where Jesus spoke of the temple of his body. All right. So in Matthew, it's 19 times, 11 of which are the physical building. In Mark, 12 times, 9 of which are the physical building. Now, in Luke, 18 times, 14 times being the physical building. In the book of John, a total of 14 times, and 11 of those those times were the building, and the 3 times that it appears as naos, I pointed out in John 2, 19, 20, and 21. In the book of Acts, the building is referred to, or hieron, 25 times. The only 2 times that naos is used, it's temples in the plural, and it's Acts chapter 7, verse 48, and we'll read that. Acts 7 and 48. Howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet. Okay, and that's naos. And also in Acts chapter 17, verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. And those 2 occurrences in the book of Acts are naos, 7:48 and 17:24. The other 25 times are all hieron. Okay, so Luke obviously could tell the difference between the book of Luke and the book of Acts. 39 times it was hieron, but only 6 times was it naos. And let's go to the book of Luke, and in chapter 1 he used naos 3 times. Luke chapter 1 verses 9. According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. So that sounds to me like a physical building. And 21, and the people waited for Zacharias and marveled that he tarried so long in the temple. And that was when he was being visited and that when he was made so he couldn't speak. And 22, and when he came out, he could not speak unto them, and they perceived that he had seen a vision in the temple. So in Luke chapter 1, he uses naos 3 times there, but it sounds to me like it refers to the physical temple. Chapter 23, verse 45. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into... No, that's 46, sorry. So you gets an idea where we're at. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. And that's also physical. So naos can possibly refer to a physical temple, fane, shrine, temple, but it also can refer to inner sanctum or central sanctuary. So where am I going with this? In Paul's epistles, he uses temple, looks like 11 times. Only 1 time did he use hieron, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 13. Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? And I believe he's referring to the Levitical priests. They live off of the things, that come to the temple. So that's the only time in Paul's epistles that he used hieron. The remainder of the time he used naos. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he used it 4 times. Oops. Okay. Chapter 3, 1 Corinthians, verses 16 and 17. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. So that's obviously naos, the temple of the body. Also, chapter 6, verse 19. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? And then 8 and verse 10. For if any man see thee, which has knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple. So he uses naos there. Also in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and 16, it's used, verse 16, it's used twice. And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, and as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So chapter 6, 2 Corinthians 6, 16, used twice, obviously referring to the temple of the body, naos. And in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 21, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord. And I think that that's also referring to a temple of the body, in whom ye are also builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. So you're the temple of the Holy Spirit. God lives through you, and habitation of God through the Spirit. So that's obviously referring to naos, the temple of the body. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. And I'll lead in with verse 3. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. So you know where we're at contextually. And chapter 2, verse 4. Who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, shewing himself that he is God. And that's also appearing as naos. So again, Paul used temple 11 times in the epistles, 7 times in 1 Corinthians, one of which was 24:11, hieron. The remainder of the other 10 times were all naos, and many of those, as you can see, refer to the temple of the body. So, four books: 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. Hieron used once, and 10 times naos. Now here's an even more interesting. I didn't look at any of the verses as yet, not closely anyway. We saw that in the book of John, that John used hieron 11 times, and only 3 times was naos used. Again, John chapter 2, verses 19, 20, and 21. He didn't use the word temple at all in the epistles. But John wrote the Gospel of John, the epistles of John, and Revelation. In the book of Revelation, the 16 times that temple appears each one of them is naos. None of them are hieron. And Revelation 3:12, him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, and I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. 3:12. 7:15. Therefore are they before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple, and he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. There, that sounds to me like a physical place, because they're taking measurements. And in verse 19, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in the temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and earthquake and great hail. And I won't go through the remainder of them, but it appears in 14, 15, 16, and 21 twice. Actually, it appears twice each in those, except for chapter 15, and it appears 4 times, verses 5, 6, and twice in 8. But just for curiosity's sake, let's look at chapter 21 and verse 22, where it appears twice. And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. So, a little tale of 2 temples, hieron and naos. It's obvious that John understood that there was 2 different words, or he wouldn't have in chapter 2 used 2 different words. And to me, it's a mystery why, if verse 20, the Jews were referring to a physical building, why didn't he swap back and use hieron 24:11 like he had earlier in the chapter? And then Paul almost exclusively used naos in the majority of the times in 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. It appears that he's referring to the temple of the body and not a physical temple. And in Revelation, at no time is hieron used. All 16 occurrences are naos. So, did something change with the vernacular of Greek? Some say that the Gospel of John was written somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 110 A.D., and Revelation was, most people say, 95 to 96 A.D. So, something to consider, something to think about, maybe to pray on. Definitely has my curiosity roused, or else I wouldn't have made a video. Thanks for taking a few minutes and hearing me out, and there is a comment section below, so if you have any comments that you'd like to put, please do so. Give me some feedback. Tell me what you think about it.